Among journalists, aid workers, and diplomats who've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, one Afghan name is mentioned more than any other: Ahmad Shah Masoud. In the 1980s, he was the most effective resistance leader against the Soviets. In the 1990s, he fought the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I first met him in 1986, during the Soviet War. In the 1980s, during the Soviet War, this was how you reached northern Afghanistan. 12 days, over 5 high passes. One guerrilla commander more than any other was making the Red Army bleed: Ahmad Shah Masoud. From their Panjshir Valley homes, Masoud's Mujahideen expanded into neighboring valleys and provinces. Masoud received only a minor share of U.S. support. His vision for an independent Afghanistan clashed with the policies of Pakistan, the Americans' middleman. The Pakistanis backed Afghan extremist groups that furthered Pakistan's goals. Still, Masoud's movement thrived, mainly through his populist appeal. He told me his main objective was to resolve conflict among different resistance groups, to unite them against the Russians. Masoud was the most charismatic, capable, and effective guerrilla leader in all of Afghanistan. That made him the Russians' Afghan enemy #1. In July of 1986, Masoud's men showed me where they'd killed 30 Soviet Special Forces troops, Spetsnaz. Masoud pored over captured maps, his own camp clearly marked. Only minutes later, Soviet jets came looking for revenge. In their soufs, or shelters, the guerrillas displayed their great advantage: an uncanny ability to survive. There were no casualties. Masoud emerged cracking jokes. His humor was infectious. The only real damage? A graze on my camera case. Something else to laugh about over tea. During the 1980s war between Soviet occupation forces and Afghan Mujahideen guerrillas, one resistance leader gained international renown: Ahmad Shah Masoud. One quality that set him apart: Masoud strived to earn the support of the people rather than demanding it. He listened to his people's concerns and ideas. Without the food and shelter civilians could offer, Masoud's guerrillas stood no chance against the Russians. 1/5 of the Panjshir Valley's population remained, braving Soviet air attacks, which targeted civilians. A narrow escape, but the people's will to survive was inspiring to see. In 1986, Masoud told me, "We hear a lot on the radio about Western aid, but practically inside the country, we haven't yet seen any effective help for our people." Finally, the Kremlin gave up and pulled the Red Army out of Afghanistan in 1989. The Soviets continued to back Afghan Communist President Najibullah. As civil war raged, Masoud sought more support from the West, but an old adversary got in the way: Pakistan, the middleman delivering U.S. aid. Pakistan's military constantly undermined Masoud, realizing that if he ever gained uncontested power in Afghanistan, it would become a more stable, a stronger neighbor, a potential competitor. The alliance of Mujahideen parties fractured. A savage battle to capture Jalalabad ended in stalemate. Najibullah's regime clung to power for 3 more years. Masoud, whose Northern Council was the dominant military power, tried to keep order while the parties talked. But meantime, Pakistan urged on its Afghan client, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Civil war resumed, and by 1994, 9 different militias fought savagely to seize Kabul. Masoud's dream of uniting the former Mujahideen was shattered. Ahmad Shah Masoud, with UN help, tried to avoid civil war in the early 1990s. But his rival, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, rained rockets on Kabul, seeking power for himself, with Pakistani backing. Busy bazaars were laid waste. Traffic once clogged Kabul's streets. No longer. The capital's broad avenues had been places of color. Then, deserts. Kabulis sought refuge to bury their young. This man told me, "Why isn't the United Nations, if there is such a thing, helping us? Our houses are bombed and the dead are left behind." Then, in 1996, a new force claimed salvation, the Taliban, again backed by Pakistan. Masoud withdrew from Kabul to avoid another bloodbath. The Taliban tracked down former communist president Najibullah and showed the world Taliban justice. For the next 5 years, Masoud's Northern Alliance was the only force that prevented the Taliban and their Arab extremist guests from taking the whole country. Tragically, successive United States administrations failed to give Masoud and the Afghan people the support they deserved, or heed Masoud's warnings about the Taliban and Al-Qaeda until it was too late. In April 2001, Masoud addressed the European Parliament in Strasbourg. He warned the West, stop the Taliban and Al-Qaeda now, or suffer the consequences. The Taliban had become more isolated in Afghanistan, he said, and this pushed them to seek more help from Pakistan and bin Laden. Masoud's appeal went unanswered. The CIA asked for his help with intelligence on bin Laden, but Masoud's Northern Alliance forces received no substantial new aid. Then Al-Qaeda struck. On September 9th, Masoud was killed by suicide bombers. Bin Laden's most capable enemy was dead. 2 days later, the cost of Washington's inept policies in Afghanistan became painfully clear. As craftsmen built Masoud's tomb in the Panjshir, the U.S. acted at last. An international coalition was raised to push the Taliban out of Kabul. Masoud's men made up the dominant ground force. Today, war continues in Afghanistan, as before, due largely to interference from Pakistan and blowback-prone policies from Washington. Afghans grieve a fallen leader and the thought of what might have been.